Thanks actually for the opportunity to speak to you today. I have long wanted to attend this meeting, so it's a real pleasure to be here. That project centers on the physiographic black belt of the American South, and it is in many ways a landscape history, or it's become a landscape history, influenced indeed by folks like W.G. Huskins. But the environmental historian in me will be pretty evident today as well, because one of the central tensions I explore in this project is inherent in the term landscape itself, which is to say the tension between landscape as an aesthetic and landscape as a material thing. After thinking about a number of ways I could take this talk, I decided in the end that maybe the best thing to do was to simply offer an overview of the project, something that sort of skip quickly ahead to the 20th century, where we'll pause for a couple of case studies that highlight various aspects of the project. The first is going to focus more on the aesthetic side of landscape, and the second on the more material side. Given the venue, I should probably add that some of the chapters do have substantive connections to Britain, but those aren't going to be my focus today. The talk, though, is an homage of sorts to Henry Fox Talbot, a Brit, one of the key inventors, of course, of photography. For Talbot, the sun was the pencil of nature, the title of his 1844 book, of course, the first to be illustrated with photographs. Because it was sunlight that imprinted those images, he called the photographs sun pictures or sun sketches. And that is, after a fashion, then what I'm going to do today, offer a few snapshots of the intersection of nature and culture in the Black Belt rather than a coherent narrative of that history. Okay, so what is this physiographic Black Belt? The term Black Belt is most commonly used to refer to the demographic Black Belt, which is to say that portion of the American South stretching from Virginia to Texas, where the preponderance, or at least a sizable percentage of the population, was African American. This map shows the counties where at least 40% of the population was black in 1930. My project, however, is not dealing with the demographic Black Belt per se. It refers to a distinct geographical region, much, but not all of which, overlaps with the demographic Black Belt. You can actually see it from space. You can see it on the slide if you wanted to. You'll see it a little bit more clearly if you zoom in. It's the crescent-shaped area of light green northwest of Florida and east of the Mississippi River. And if you zoom in again, you can see that it is almost entirely in the states of Alabama and Mississippi. So if you look at a county map, you can see that the region curves from east central Alabama into northeast Mississippi. It is not an especially scenic region. It is, by almost every measure, an ordinary landscape. There aren't huge numbers of tourists who frequent the region for its scenic vistas, mostly because there aren't very many scenic vistas. In fact, despite its rich connections to important moments of the civil rights movement, it doesn't get a lot of visitors at all, at least visitors who don't come armed for hunts of various sorts. It's worth underscoring, though, the region's important connections to the civil rights movement. Tuskegee, Alabama, on the far right blue marker there, was the home of Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Montgomery, to its left, is where Rosa Parks started a boycott that gave real momentum to the civil rights movement and marked the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr. as a major figure in the civil rights movement. Selma, Alabama, to its left, was where police attacked peaceful protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. Between Selma and Montgomery lies Lowndes County, where grassroots activists launched a movement that helped inspire the creation of the Black Panthers, and we could go on. These overlaps with the demographic Black Belt certainly matter in the project in ways that I'll hint at today, but I'm considering it, again, chiefly as a distinct bioregion bound together by a distinctive geology and ecology. This bioregion resulted from an accident of nature. For the Black Belt chases the shoreline of an ancient, basically Cenozoic era sea, in a crescent-shaped curve around the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, where over millions of years, the gradual deposition of microscopic algae called coccoliths created or left a deep limestone subsoil, which is known locally as Selma chalk. That could be as deep as 275 meters, and along the riverways, you can actually see chalk cliffs. This is Tombigbee River here. Atop the subsoil lay the richest soils in the South, at least the richest soils that weren't found in land reclaimed from swampland, like the Mississippi Delta. And in contrast to most of the soils of the South, the Black Belt soils are alkaline rather than acidic, and for the most part, they're quite shallow, with the topsoil stretching inches rather than meters as you would find in the Mississippi Delta. The combination of soil type and its depth gave it some unique characteristics that set it apart from the rest of the South, and which carry consequences for a number of things, including its flora and fauna. So here you can see, for instance, how the South's longleaf pine forest, which once stretched across some 90 million acres, curled around the Black Belt of Alabama. The comparatively shallow soils of the Black Belt didn't allow longleaf pine to sink their taproots. So things like eastern red cedar did much better in the region. Probably the most characteristic feature of the environment that emerged from this geological perfect storm, there were a series of smallish prairies, as noted 19th century British naturalist Philip Henry Goss, who spent 8 months there in 1838 as a tutor on a plantation in Dallas County, Alabama. He observed that these prairies were typically surrounded by woods, quote, on every side as an abrupt wall. Indeed, these pockets of prairie lend the physiographic Black Belt its other common name, the Black Prairie region. So the story this project tells starts in some meaningful way with the deep history of this place. But I'm a historian, of course, rather than an earth scientist. And so I'm very much interested in the intersection of people with this natural world. And this project is, of course, a work of history. Historians, American historians, Southern historians, have spent a great deal of time exploring questions of identity and race. Southern identity has been at the heart of Southern history since it emerged as a discrete discipline in the 1920s. And as a subcategory of American history, the field of Southern history presupposes that the region has been distinctive in some way, and that these distinctives have set it apart from the rest of the country. And generations of historians have teased out the nuances of those distinctives as they've evolved over time. The South, they've concluded, and this is hugely reductionist, but has existed as much as an idea as a place, even if the defining attributes of that idea have shifted over time. Race, too, has been the familiar terrain of historians in this region almost from the beginning. In the South, of course, this has been the case in no small measure because the region's identity was bound up in racial distinctives. How could race not matter in a region whose economy was marked by race-based slavery and then tenancy, and where a public commitment to white supremacy lasted longer than anywhere else in the United States? But if race and identity have long been the familiar subjects of Southern historians, landscape hasn't attracted anywhere near as much attention from historians, really Southern or otherwise. And here's where the project departs both from natural scientists, who tend to discount history, as you probably know, because it's messy and contingent, rather than governed by predictable laws, and historians who tend to view the other than human world as basically as a backdrop rather than as a historical actor. So one of the central claims of the project is that historians ought to be taking landscape change more seriously than we have to date. That the Southern landscape in this case is a historical source of sorts with its own story to tell, one that offers a sidelong view into ostensibly familiar subjects, and so helps us understand Southern history, by extension American history, and American identity in new ways, and I hope a little bit better. In other words, I argue that the region's history is literally inscribed on the land, and that we would be wise to pay attention to it. The project stakes that claim over something of the longue durée. It covers 3 or 4 centuries. With that in mind, the historical part of the project really begins with the radically re-altered world of the region's indigenous inhabitants, which was a world thrown into chaos by disease and war as a result of European colonization. And so it begins with the world of the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations that emerged from the shattering of the Mississippian cultures that had existed at the time of European contact. And there's an awful lot we could talk about here. One of the chapters, for instance, focuses on Fort Tombecby, which is above the Choctaws word, and Fort Toulouse, which were variously controlled by the French, English, and Spanish, mostly because of the region's connections to the deerskin trade, but also because the region was briefly imagined to be a vital hub of empire, which is fascinating in its own right, but we don't have time to take that up today, so we'll put it to the side. To return to the landscape and say that to rightly understand the landscape as its 18th century inhabitants did, whether they were Native Americans or Europeans, you need to do it from the vantage point of the region's numerous waterways, from a canoe or from the bow of a ship. Those waterways, incidentally, represented the world's most biodiverse freshwater ecosystem. In the wake of the American Revolution, those waterways became a major focus of white Americans as this map of the Mississippi Territory underscores. In the event, it was the terrible luck of the region's indigenous inhabitants that the deerskin trade collapsed at virtually the same moment that the widespread production of cotton was made possible by the invention of the cotton gin. The Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws moved, in short, from being vital cogs in the global economy to being impediments to it. This transition would tragically and famously culminate in Indian removal in the 1830s, a vast exercise in what today we would call ethnic cleansing, in which the indigenous inhabitants of the region were forcibly removed at gunpoint to what was then viewed as the Great American Desert, and today is Oklahoma. For the landscape, however, it pretended the arrival of more widespread agricultural cultivation than the region had ever seen. As you can see from this map of Alabama's waterways, the state's major navigable riverways, the Tombigbee to the left and the Alabama to the right. You could imagine basically what white planters might have seen when they first encountered this. Some of the richest soil they'd ever encountered, in fields that often didn't need to be cleared, along waterways that connected them to global markets. Surely, they thought, this is the hand of God blessing the institution of slavery. One of the reasons, incidentally, that the demographic black belt doesn't overlap entirely with the physiographic black belt is that the Tombigbee River ceased to be navigable a little bit past Columbus, Mississippi, which is just into Mississippi. So you can see this is a map of the navigable waterways in the United States as of 1830. You'll notice that the Tombigbee was navigable only a very short ways into Mississippi. Prior to the arrival of the railroad in northeast Mississippi then, which didn't arrive till the 1850s, the prairie patches were equally rich, but too far removed from markets to make plantation-based agriculture profitable. But where the rivers were navigable, the region soon became one of the centers of the South's cotton production, which by the 1830s accounted for half of the value of all American exports. It's no surprise that the Confederacy located its first capital in Montgomery, the Black Belt's most important city, and the project goes on to trace the establishment and collapse of a slave-based plantation economy situated at the very forefront of 19th century global capitalism. And there's several chapters here that weave a bunch of threads through them. One of those centers on competing landscapes that emerged as white planters and their enslaved workers occupied the region. We have a formal or white landscape and then a subaltern landscape that was shaped, navigated, and understood by enslaved folks and some other people on the margins. But we're going to skip all that as well and speed ahead to the late 19th century and early 20th century, which witnessed the emergence of what you might think of what I call an ecology of segregation. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this. So understanding what is meant by an ecology of segregation requires that we turn our attention to the ways in which Americans, northern and southern, liberal and conservative, came to identify the tenant landscapes of the Cotton Belt as the quintessential southern landscape during the first half of the 20th century. And to do that, we have to back up to the end of the Civil War, which brought substantial changes to the agricultural landscapes of the South. So this is an 1877 article from the New York Times describing Alabama's Black Belt, and it makes clear the fact that these changes were initially understood in a negative light. So this article begins with a curious homage to a lost cause mythology that was only beginning to coalesce at the time, and that celebrated the splendor of the region's plantations under slavery. But then the author abruptly shifted gears, because to visit the same region in the 1870s, he said, makes one inexpressibly sad. And then he went on to describe the landscape. There's gullies, there are poverty grass, the roads are in bad shape, the housing is poor and the like, until it concludes, decay stares one in the face on every side. And I want to underscore here that the landscape serves as a proxy by which the author measured the region's poverty. Okay? Predictably enough, given the racial climate of the times, these landscape changes came to be understood by white Southerners as the inevitable consequence of black freedom. In 1886, for instance, E.C. Betts, Alabama's first commissioner of agriculture, accounted for the sorry condition of the Black Belt counties by pointing to their black labor force. The fact that whites there tended to congregate in towns, leaving the lands for the most part to the exclusive possession of black farmers, thereby relieving them from the moral restraint and of the presence of the superior race, as well as from their industrial supervision and control, went a long way, in Betts's mind, toward explaining the environmental degradation that attended tenancy. Indeed, it offered a justification of sorts for the Jim Crow laws that were then being formulated by the various southern states. It offered proof, as it were, that African Americans weren't ready to enjoy the full benefits of freedom. The use of these denuded agro-ecosystems in the Black Belt and really the Cotton Belt more generally to justify Jim Crow understandably upset W.E.B. Du Bois, who went out of his way to address it in his classic 1903 study, The Souls of Black Folk, when he explained that the black tenants are careless because they have not found that it pays to be careful. They are improvident because the improvident ones of their acquaintance get on about as well as the provident. Above all, they cannot see why they should take unusual pains to make the white man's land better. On the other hand, the white landowner argues that any attempt to improve these laborers by increased responsibility or higher wages or better homes or land of their own would be sure to result in failure. He shows his northern visitor the scarred and wretched land, the ruined mansions, the worn-out soil, the mortgaged acres, and says, "This is black freedom." Du Bois' analysis was spot on. But here, I want you to note that he didn't deny that there were real changes in the landscape. This is one of the trickiest parts of the book to write, actually. However wrong their diagnoses, white Southerners were indeed observing real environmental transformations. So here we get the first meaning of an ecology of segregation, which is a literal one. The rise of Jim Crow set in motion landscape changes that literally altered ecologies. The most famous example of this is erosion. White landlords and black tenants both had every incentive to cultivate as much cotton as possible, and so there was little incentive to allow, let alone encourage, any kind of diversification. And there was even less incentive, as Du Bois hints here, to responsibly steward the lands, since the economic, legal, social, and political institutions of the South allowed for the exploitation of black farmers at every turn. Even under the best circumstances, improving the land might only result in higher rents for black farmers. The result was an explosion in cotton production that far surpassed the amount of cotton that was produced in the antebellum era, and also unprecedented erosion. This could certainly be seen in the Black Belt. This is pictures from Macon County, Alabama. But as scholars like the geographer Stanley Trimble and more recently the historian Paul Sutter have shown, for environmental reasons rooted in the South's geology, the erosion was even more marked in the Piedmont regions of the South. So here's a photograph from Chilton County, Alabama, just north of the Black Belt, and another one from East Alabama. This is an Arthur Rothstein New Deal photograph. You can see the man standing in the middle. But perhaps the most iconic example is Providence Canyon in Georgia, which today is a state park, the subject of Paul Sutter's book, and of course, an erosion gully. There were other literal transformations in the ecosystem, however, some we might think of as benign. For example, the edges of the denuded fields and often poorly tended fields provided an ideal habitat for some of the region's most readily identified game animals, including bobwhite quail. These landscape changes, in other words, were actually good for some species. Others were perhaps less benign. The eroded landscapes of the New South created an impetus to import kudzu to help control erosion by the 1930s. This contributed to an emerging cattle industry, which is a thread I pick up in a different chapter, actually. Kudzu's pretty good browse for cattle, surprisingly, but it famously grew very quickly, on the order of a foot a day. And you can see it creeping up and over trees in this picture, and it's become one of the plant species most readily identified with the South. It's an invasive species. It's the vine that ate the South, which is slightly overblown, but you can see why people would think that it's the vine that ate the South. We could spend more time talking about the ways in which Jim Crow segregation reshaped the material world of the South, but in some ways I think it's more instructive to approach this ecology of segregation from a cultural angle. That we think of landscape not merely as a material thing, which is how the term landscape is most commonly used, of course, but as a visual aesthetic, which privileges the original sense in which the word landscape entered the English language when it did so through Dutch at the tail end of the 16th century as a means of describing a particular kind of painting. And within that genre, it quickly gained the meaning of a view or a prospect that captured the essence of a place, or some part of that essence anyway. Indeed, if the landscape changes that accompanied the emergence of tenancy in the South's plantation belts were initially understood negatively, it didn't take too long for them to be reinterpreted and, in fact, naturalized. Almost as soon as Jim Crow laws were firmly entrenched, the landscape changes, excepting, importantly, erosion, that were initially lamented, came to be celebrated. And for this, I'm going to take you briefly away from the Black Belt and over to the South Carolina and the Hampton plantation of the celebrated nature writer Archibald Rutledge, a figure I encountered via a colleague and now collaborator on this part of the project, Jason Ward, who's now at Emory University. But he was researching the rise of a self-consciously segregationist movement in opposition to the long civil rights movement. Rutledge was a prominent contributor to Saturday Evening Post, Field and Stream, Boy's Life. He was also South Carolina's first poet laureate. And he offers an example par excellence of a broader current that rolled black tenants into the South's landscape. As you can see from this quotation here, Rutledge blurred the lines between nature, the Southern landscape, and black tenants on his plantation. And he wrote the book you're looking at, God's Children, in 1947 to celebrate the connection between his black tenants and the landscape of his plantation. And again, we could spend lots more time on this. He equated the woodland skills of black Southerners to Native Americans in ways that are genuinely striking, actually. But we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to acknowledge first that some of this was clearly wishful thinking. This is the final plate from God's Children, and you can see the caption here. This is the myth of Southern paternalism. God's children love the great house. It is not mine, but ours. In a letter to his son, shortly after the book's publication, he gave lie to the whole thing, complaining that his tenants had become unruly and his Hampton plantation had become, quote, a place of continuous dread, upset, and disgrace. But I think it would be mistaken to dismiss this merely as wishful thinking. He was quite serious about this incorporation of black labor into an idealized Southern landscape. He assigned black farmers a niche that was as much ecological as it was social. In contrast to Southern politicians who played up sexual fears and racial resentment, Rutledge deployed a nostalgic and naturalized rationalization for Jim Crow. For Rutledge, in fact, black labor was an essential part of the Southern landscape. Looking out across the plantation landscape of South Carolina's low country, Rutledge literally read Jim Crow out of it. Black poverty was naturalized, sacralized even, as a vital feature of the Southern landscape. It was scenic, in other words. It was, as you can see in the quotation here, a happy blending with the plantation landscape. It's with this in mind that I think it makes sense to revisit his opposition to early manifestations of the civil rights movement. Indeed, he spent a good bit of energy during the 20s, 30s, and 40s arguing in effect that a push for racial equality was unnatural, as he did in this 1944 article in the American Mercury. After all, his logic went, if black farmers were naturally suited to tenancy and it belonged in tenant landscapes, any effort to force racial equality was an attempt to extract black Southerners from their ostensibly natural habitat, and in doing so, turn a child of nature, Rutledge's words, into what nature never intended him to be. And by that, of course, he meant the political and social equal of whites. But focusing on Rutledge might give you the wrong idea, because this was not a peculiarly Southern view of things. The quotation you saw from Du Bois a few minutes ago was part of a chapter in which he indicted his fellow sociologists, most of whom were Northerners trained at Northern universities, for practicing window car sociology, basically looking out the train car windows as the landscape sped by and concluding that African Americans were either happy or deservedly poor. Their word would be shiftless. But how do we know that Du Bois and Rutledge weren't outliers, that Americans from other regions also embraced this kind of plantation nostalgia that perpetuated a view of the Southern landscape that naturalized black labor and black poverty? Well, we could begin by looking at advertising. You're looking at an advertisement for Cottolene, which is a shortening made from beef tallow and cottonseed oil. It's a competitor of Crisco, if you guys know Crisco. You can see from that, from the top, that it's nature's gift from the sunny South. This one's a little bit exceptional, actually, in that it's an image of the product. This one would be more typical insofar as their advertisements were often landscape paintings with black labor front and center. And this was part of a national campaign, so clearly they thought such images would resonate not only in the South, but around the country. Black labor is first and foremost in the image, but it's invisible in the caption. Here's another one of their advertisements. Sometimes advertisements were even more explicit about this, and the more awkward, I think, for it. This is a 1939 Monsanto advertisement that seeks to naturalize the plastics they were producing. But you could look to other kinds of advertising as well. You can see the idealized landscape on this sheet music, which was published by a Midwest and Indiana flour manufacturer. It came complete with songs like Old Black Joe and Dixie, of course. And again, black labor is front and center as part of an idealized Southern landscape. You can probably see best just how far-reaching this vision was by looking at the efforts of New Dealers who were working to rectify the problems facing black Southerners in the 1930s, because they bought into the same view. in which rural black poverty represented an essential part of the Southern landscape. So here you're looking at photographs by Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, Walker Evans. All of them are landscapes after a fashion. So if we move back to the Black Belt, I can offer the visit of the Farm Security Administration team to Gee's Bend in Alabama's Black Belt as a second example of this kind of romanticized view of Southern landscape rooted in tenant agro-ecosystems. If you look at the headline up top, another New York Times article about their visit, you'll note that Gee's Bend is described as a picturesque community. You can find the same language actually in the official report, which noted, and here I'm going to quote, that the, quote, visitors themselves wonder if the well-intentioned plans of the government, the redistribution of these picturesque and normally happy independent people, end quote, were really wise. The implication, of course, was that black Southerners were most at home in these Southern agricultural landscapes. We could, I think, rightly contend that the Southern landscape aesthetic carried real implications for the civil rights movement. It wasn't only Southern conservatives like Rutledge who believed, as this article reported, the same New York Times article, that the racial virtues preserved in tenant landscapes of the South's plantation districts were vastly worth preserving because they disappear in more civilized quarters where the ambition of African Americans must become only carbon copies of whites. That African Americans, in short, were particularly or peculiarly even fitted for Southern landscapes. Smug academics like yours truly were no more immune to this than Rutledge, or advertisers or New Dealers. This is from a study of Alabama's Black Belt in the Journal of Economic Geography in the 1940s. And again, you can see the caption, these people are happy, content in their lot, ideally situated in their landscape. The scenic view of black poverty led almost full circle, helping to lock Southern African Americans in a cycle of dependence, debt, and poverty. As you can see in this article here, it became a rationale that hindered efforts to diversify Southern fields. In this case, it hindered the diversification or the adoption of cattle in the Black Belt. Because black farmers were supposedly fitted for cotton production in tenant landscapes, the article argued, whites basically had trouble imagining them in other agricultural contexts. And so the livestock industry, the development of that would depend on, quote, intelligent, energetic white farmers. Black voices, of course, pointed to the absurdity of this. And they saw for what it was, an effort to naturalize Jim Crow. Even so, they sometimes drew on the same aesthetic to indict the status quo. Echoing Du Bois, they would leverage white fears of agricultural decline as an indictment of an unjust and oppressive system that pressed down on the land as well as people. You can see this, for instance, in anti-lynching campaigns. Predictably, these black voices were ignored at the time. But here's the thing. If a landscape aesthetic bound up in one of the early 20th century South's most familiar institutions, Jim Crow, proved so far-reaching, maybe we ought to take more seriously claims like Rutledge's, that the civil rights movement, was unnatural. In the context of the time, it wasn't merely rhetorical. Southerners, and as we've seen, Americans more generally, literally saw that in the landscape. They saw these inhabited tenant landscapes as natural, scenic, quintessentially Southern. By itself, of course, this does not explain resistance to the push for civil rights, but it did provide yet another kind of inertia that the movement had to overcome. For our purposes today, and sort of this overview, the big thing to keep in mind is that a new social system reshaped the material landscape, which in turn created a new landscape aesthetic. And so, as you might expect, a shift in that social and economic system would result in a shifting landscape aesthetic and indeed a radically re-altered material world as well. In the Black Belt, as elsewhere in the South, those changes came in the years following World War II, as the region's tenant system teetered and collapsed. And a new, modern agricultural system that applied new technologies to maximize production replaced it. So here's our second example of the ways in which material, aesthetic, and landscape changes shifted in ways that cobbled on to regional identity. The mechanics of that collapse mirrored that of other agricultural regions, with farm consolidation, petrochemical inputs, and the like. Though it did take on particular regional valences, as noted agricultural historian Jack Temple Kirby argued, these neo-plantations, his phrase, saw well-capitalized farms replace undercapitalized farms, but remain in a quasi-colonial economic position relative to the rest of the country. In a different talk, we could explore those more fully, but what matters today is the fact that the changes in the landscape are real, and not only because black tenants found themselves pushed off of these farms. So this is a USDA map you're looking at from the early 1960s, and it shows that cotton never really disappeared from the Black Belt, but increasingly cotton fields there gave way to soybeans. I'm not going to try and replicate Paul's econometric analysis of yesterday, but I can give you some numbers. So in 1940, Alabama produced nearly 800,000 bales of cotton and 72,000 bushels of soybeans. By 1950, the state's cotton production had dropped to 600,000 bales, while its soybean production had risen to 1.3 million bushels. Of course, it wasn't wholly linear. Cotton production went up in some years when commodity prices were favorable for cotton. There was an upturn in cotton production, for instance, in the mid-1960s. So in 1965, some 852,000 bales of cotton were harvested. But the expansion of cotton in those years did not come at the expense of soybeans. That same year, the state's soybean harvest came to more than 5 million bushels. By 1975, the state harvested only 312,000 bales of cotton, but more than 32 million bushels of soybeans. And the heart of that is in the Black Belt. Even as soy fields were replacing cotton fields, the Black Belt became the leading cattle and dairy region in the state. Really, it was beef cattle that led the way, surpassing cotton as the state's leading agricultural commodity by 1950. And the Black Belt produced 2/3 of those cattle. You'll note that in the flyer on the right, Montgomery, the former capital of the Confederacy, is already rebranding itself as the cow town of the South. And to these transformations, more could still be added. The 1950s saw the proliferation of farm ponds, the emergence of tree farms, the reforestation of what had once been submarginal land. Predictably, these agricultural shifts set in motion profound ecological transformations. It would be easy enough to talk about the costs of those transformations. So the expansion of domestic cattle, for instance, carved away at prairie remnants that had survived the cotton years. Native prairie plants were threatened by the introduction of new turf grasses, primarily coastal Bermuda. Though initially cattlemen relied on Johnson grass, which is pictured here, which is a highly invasive bunch grass, so invasive that it's now illegal to plant it in the southern region of the United States. But these new grasses, of course, outcompeted native species, which were also hindered by soil compaction and by chemical drift as increasing chemical inputs of the nearby farms added up. But it might actually be a wildlife success story that underscores just how far the ecological ripples of these agroecological transformations could be felt. As late as 1920, the best estimates placed Alabama's deer population at between 1 and 3,000 deer. Deer were reintroduced to the state in the 1920s. By 1940, there were some 14,000 deer in the state. Deer are a fecund species, and together with additional introductions in the post-war years and policies limiting the harvesting of does, by 1960, the state's deer population had climbed to more than 100,000, and by 1970, it had leaped to at least 400,000. Today, it's approaching 2 million. By the 1990s, that had begun reshaping the landscape of Alabama in 1,000 corners, as increasingly suburban homeowners, like those in many other parts of the United States, actually began cultivating deer-proof plants rather than plants that were particularly fragrant or beautiful. In the process, and as they did this, it changed what people think of and actually what they experience as a southern landscape, which is kind of fascinating. The fact that by the 1990s, deer had become a pest for southern suburban homeowners highlights the fact that multiple factors were at work. It wasn't just soybeans and cattle that changed the region, but while there were other factors, wildlife areas replaced submarginal land, suburban development surrounded the region's cities and larger towns. But there's no doubt that this growth in the deer population was facilitated by those agroecological transformations. In short, while deer sometimes feed on young cotton plants, they do much better with soybeans. And indeed, the Black Belt in the 1950s and 1960s might have, certainly was among, if it wasn't the best, it was among the best places in the country to hunt for whitetail trophies, which is a bit surprising, actually, considering Bergman's rule, which observes that warm-blooded animals of the same species will be larger in colder climes than warmer ones. In short, you'd expect larger deer in northern states rather than southern states like Alabama. And generally, that's the case. Lots of reasons for this, for why they were such a good place to hunt. And the project actually carries the story forward to the genetic modification of deer for high fence hunting establishments in the early 2000s. But for our purposes today, what matters is that many of the hunters began coming to the Black Belt less for the trophies than for the southern experience that the Black Belt offered. And this brings us back to the intersection of landscape and race. Here, if we wanted to, we can invert causation of our first case study, because if efforts to regulate race relations wound up leaving an imprint on the natural world and the ways in which it was understood, it was no less true that efforts to protect the ostensibly natural world through things like hunting regulations carried implications for race relations. So Alabama's 1907 game law, which was pioneering for the region — Mississippi didn't have a statewide game law until the 1930s, it was passed in part by playing on racial fears. And when in 1912, Alabama's game commissioner looked back on the passage of the game law, he counted the disarming of the state's black population as one of its signal accomplishments. There's no reason to doubt the sincerity of the people who pushed for the game law. At the time, deer, as we've seen, had been pushed to the brink of extirpation. But the law just as clearly served more than one purpose. Unsurprisingly, when deer hunting resumed in the region in the 1920s, much of it took place on private land, which created a landscape of exclusion, much to the chagrin of the non-elite whites who were also pushed to the side. Many openly advocated, as Matthew pointed out yesterday, for a system of public lands hunting that was more inclusive and one that was, quote, compatible with American ideals and traditions, and stood in contrast to the, quote, European system of private ownership of game that seemed to be reflected in Alabama's Black Belt. But we're going to pick up the story in the post-war years because as the deer population rebounded after World War II, private hunting clubs continued to proliferate, increasingly styling themselves by the 1960s, which is in the midst of the civil rights movement, as plantations, invoking a sanitized Southern heritage that flew in the face of the social changes then racking the country. In some ways, this marked an extension of the cultural landscape framed by the Southern imaginary that had marked the pre-war years, echoing the nostalgic vision of the racial virtues espoused by the FSA visitors to Gee's Bend. So, for example, when in 1966, Sports Illustrated carried an article on L.B. Maytag's Sedgefield plantation, it's that Maytag appliances, the author celebrated the plantation's virtues by concluding that it was, quote, the Old South formalities of plantation hunting that made hunting at Sedgefield so memorable. But while some would continue to cultivate that pre-war imaginary, in the wake of the civil rights movement, it became increasingly untenable to do so. In fact, ties to the older cotton landscape, which were once celebrated as an essential and scenic component of the Southern landscape, became a liability in many cases. This is evident in the fact, for instance, that the National Cotton Council relocated from Memphis to New York City in 1970 and went out of its way, as another colleague of mine, Jim Geeson, has noted, to divorce the product from its distasteful connections to slavery, black oppression, and tenancy, and from the Southern landscape more generally, most famously in an advertising campaign that sought to rebrand cotton as a fabric, the fabric of our lives, rather than as an agricultural product per se. As the older ties to the tenant landscapes dissipated, it created what Paul Sutter has called an ecology of erasure. In short, as tree farms, wildlife areas, soybeans, and cattle fields covered the gullied and denuded fields scarred by cotton cultivation under the tenant system, the connections between race and Southern identity that had been projected onto and read out of the Southern landscape before the war, and more than anything else distinguished regional identity, disappeared as well. With black labor removed from the field, Southern agriculture didn't look or function very different from the farms of, say, the Midwest, strengthening a shared rural identity rather than regional one that may well have eased the political remaking of the South in the 1980s as the South joined the Midwest as a solid bastion of the Republican Party. Moreover, changes in the region's landscape allowed people to consume Southern identity by coming to places, I'm using Ennin Plantation as just one example, pictured here, not only from New York City and Chicago to have a Southern experience, but from Birmingham and Atlanta to have a Southern experience, without connecting that Southern experience to racial inequity. It's clear from the guest logs, and this one's from the early 2000s, that a significant percentage of their clientele were consuming this identity. Standing in the hallway of the main house and looking up the driveway, we finally realized what Ennin is all about. It is about the timelessness of tradition. The hunting and fishing, as the last paragraph notes, is about pride and Southern heritage. As we've seen, Southerners have been unequivocal about the importance of segregation to Southern identity well into the 1960s. Indeed, it seemed rooted in the landscape itself. By the 1990s and early 2000s, however, Southerners increasingly argued that racial identity and Southern identity weren't profoundly connected at all. And in fact, with the landscape scars created by the tenant system that were once celebrated covered over in the late 90s and early 2000s, people could project an ostensibly racially neutral Southern identity back in time. It made it possible, in other words, these landscape changes, to imagine a timeless South, as this visitor did, without considering race. Landscape changes, in other words, seemingly justified a racially blind South, where racial problems were personal rather than political and divorced from the larger currents of the culture. You can actually see that in the way the region is marketed today. The slogan of the Black Belt Heritage Area is a culture as rich as the land, pretty neutral. You can buy prints like this one, where African American and white families gather socially in vaguely old-timey things. And this is at the Black Belt Cultural Arts Center. Ironically, in erasing the connection to regional identity explicitly predicated on white supremacy, these landscape changes also rendered invisible continuing racial inequities in the region's agricultural landscape. If southern fields no longer needed black faces in them to be southern, the absence of black faces there was less notable. It's no surprise that there was a sharp decline in the number of black farmers in the nation between 1940 and 1973. Some 93% of black farmers lost their farms as a result of, during those years, as a result of a number of factors, but primarily as a result, I would argue, of systemic racism in the policies of the United States Department of Agriculture, which made it harder for black farmers to get loans and often excluded them altogether. Likewise, the region became home to waste sites, accepting garbage from dozens of wealthier regions, justified by ostensibly environmental factors, most especially the hundreds of feet of limestone between the waste and the groundwater. The place you're looking at here is Amel, Alabama, which was the largest toxic waste dump in the United States by the 1990s. Even today, there are ongoing fights about other ones. This is Arrowhead Landfill in Perry County, Alabama, has attracted international attention of late as well. This is not to end on a wholly depressing note. After all, the rise of what Kirby called neo-plantations in the wake of World War II transformed cultural identities in ways that undercut as well as compounded longstanding racial inequities, opening a door for a more racially diverse South that complicated older conceptions of what it meant to be Southern. But whatever else they were, these transformations were closely connected to the landscape itself, and they entailed unexpected ecological consequences. Farmers transitioning to soybeans were hardly dreaming of a booming deer population. And if we're to rightly understand these stories of radically transformed agroecosystems and shifting Southern identities, they cannot be told in isolation. Finally, I want to conclude by noting that it is certainly true that the history imprinted on the Black Belt's landscape is tinged, more than tinged really, with tragedy. But this is true, I would argue, for much of the United States and the world. The creation of America's national parks, to pick one familiar example, heralded by no less an authority than the legendary documentary filmmaker Ken Burns as America's best idea, entailed the dispossession of the park's indigenous inhabitants. But I would argue that there's much about America's national parks that's worth celebrating nonetheless. The Black Belt, of course, is far less striking than these national parks. It's an ordinary landscape by comparison. Most landscapes are. Even so, and despite the fact that much of its history is tragic, it's nevertheless a remarkable place. We should, I think, marvel at the ecological complexities that mark the place, and by uncovering the stories embedded in that landscape, I really do hope to foster an appreciation for it. The people who live in the Black Belt today, white and black alike, often have a deep connection to, pride in even, the region as a place, and they tend to share an affection for the landscape. And so, as like the poem says, the natural world is written on and rewritten on, I think there's cause for hope. As we begin paying attention to neglected landscapes like the Black Belt and reckon with their histories, however troubled they may be, and as we learn to appreciate their complexities, as we begin to realize that these lived-in landscapes matter as much as national parks, we'll have reason to believe that subsequent imprints on the landscapes can be more sustainable, both ecologically and social. In the end, I hope the project serves as an invitation to that hope. So thank you.